Whenever a wrestler begins their career, they no doubt have ambitions of going all the way to the main event scene. But unfortunately, that just can't be the reality for everyone. No, some are destined to find a place lower down on the card. Not that this has to be a bad thing though. No, some have made a career for themselves as jobbers, and it's those people we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Brooklyn Brawler. Yes, in the annals of wrestling history, perhaps no more famous example of a legendary jobber has existed than the Brooklyn Brawler. And that's because throughout the majority of the 90s, he was always there, ready and willing to eat a pinfall to a more focused upon talent. Seriously, if you go back to the New Generation era and look at some of those early episodes of Raw, you're almost always going to find Steve Lombardi showing up somewhere. And when he was showing up, the chances were he wasn't winning. Of course, this isn't to suggest he didn't have some level of popularity with fans at the time. No, even if he were the jobber to end all jobbers in WWF, there was a certain ownership of him that the live crowds there felt for the Brawler. And that's why, at one point during the early 90s, he even underwent a brief win streak of sorts as, for the first and only time, WWF decided to actually push him for a little bit. As you can probably guess though, this push was short-lived. And so it wasn't long before he was back to jobbing again, but still, this wasn't enough to make fans turn their backs on Lombardi. Rather, they embraced him all the more for his failure to rise up the ranks. Hell, so beloved would he be during this time, there were periods that when the Brooklyn Brawler was inactive, Steve would remain in WWF under different guises like those of Kimchi, Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, and even Doink the Clown at one point. In the end though, it always came back to that most popular character for him, as that's the one he's best associated with. Would he ever get his due and win a title in the WWF? No, like any good jobber, he'd remain below that level for the entirety of his run there. But even if this was the case, his consistency was able to keep him in a job long after he retired, with him currently serving as a backstage producer. And that's meant that as things stand today, he will occasionally make an on-screen cameo in a backstage segment or something similar, a fitting way to remember someone who was always so low down on the pecking order. But the Brooklyn Brawler isn't the only legendary jobber who came out of the New Generation era of WWF. No, our next subject was perhaps the only man who could challenge him for the title of top enhancement talent of the time, the one, the only, Barry Horowitz. That's right, after having brief runs in a number of different territories throughout the 80s, including a short spell in WWF, the St. Petersburg native would return to Vince McMahon's employ to play the role of jobber to the stars. And that wasn't a bad thing necessarily. No, the wrestling world needs people to play this role. So there was no shame in Barry stepping into the ring with the likes of Tito Santana, Kerry Von Erich, Owen Hart, and Bret Hart, and staring up at the lights for them by the time all was said and done. What no one could have foreseen, however, was that as time went on, Horowitz would start to gain such a level of cult popularity with fans, there would be a demand to see him go beyond the enhancement talent role and become a featured performer. So it was then that WWF would listen to the fans, and Barry got to briefly escape the lower card. And he certainly made the most of his opportunity. What happened here exactly? Well, after beating Skip on the July 9th episode of Wrestling Challenge that year, the boy from Florida started going on something of a win streak. And this eventually led to him getting a match at that year's SummerSlam, a career highlight for him at the time. But that wasn't all. No, after winning his big pay-per-view bout, the jobber would then go on to have a somewhat successful tag team run with Hakushi as his mini-push carried on into 1996. As you can probably guess though, this mini-push would not last forever. No, by the time 96 was in full swing, Barry Horowitz would begin being pushed back down the card again as the novelty of seeing him win wore off. But even if this was how things ended, at least he can always say that for a brief moment at least, he was able to escape the life of being an enhancement talent and instead rise up to greater things, an incredibly rare feat for someone in his position. Sure, he was never able to win a title or anything. No, if we want to find an example of a jobber doing that, then we really have to move over to our next subject, a man whose main run came during the 2010s. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Heath Slater. That's right, during the PG era of WWE, you'd be hard-pressed to find a jobber who was more beloved than Heath Slater. And that's because no matter what he was being given to work with, he always managed to make it entertaining. It doesn't matter if we're talking about his runs as part of the Nexus, the Social Outcasts, Slater Gator, or perhaps most memorably 3MB, he was always able to deliver something fans could enjoy watching. Hell, his 3MB run has become legendary in hindsight when we talk about him being a perennial jobber for a more modern era, if for no other reason than because the other two members of the trio, Drew McIntyre and Jinder Mahal, would later go on to become WWE champion. Obviously though, with Heath, this never happened. No, he'd always remained stuck in the lower parts of the card as his teammates rose to bigger and better things. Well, we say that, but there was one time the West Virginian got his flowers. And that happened in 2016 when, after going undrafted during the newest incarnation of the brand split, he found himself having to beg both Raw and SmackDown for a job. But with neither side wanting him, he had to get creative, and this led to him finding a tag team partner in Rhino and making it his aim to win the SmackDown tag team titles as a free agent. Something he believed would force then Blue Brand general manager Daniel Bryan to offer him a contract. How would this work out for Slater? Pretty well as it happened, because, in a true feel-good moment, it would be at the Backlash pay-per-view that he and his tag partner were able to defeat the Usos in order to hold the straps above their heads. And yes, as a result of this, the fan favorite would finally be offered a contract and a way of feeding his kids back at home. Sure, he would pretty quickly begin falling down the card again after this. We were still talking about a jobber here after all, but for that brief moment Heath Slater was able to stand on top of the world, and this is something he'll always be able to hang his hat on. Of course, he could always go one step further because, as the only member of 3MB to never be a world champion in WWE, there's still a story to be told there with him, even if it is highly unlikely this story will ever be told now. Hell, even if he doesn't win a main roster top prize, he could always get a fluke win of the NXT title. It wouldn't be like he'd be the first jobber to rise all the way to the top and hold the #1 prize in a promotion, because years prior to that, during mid-90s ECW, this very same thing was happening with our next subject, Mikey Whipwreck. That's right, if there were ever an ultimate jobber to be found in Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling, then this would be him, because the story of Mikey Whipwreck truly is that of one of the most unlikely of heroes finding success. And when we're talking about the land of misfit toys that was Philadelphia back then, being an unlikely hero amongst the group of them is certainly saying something. But then when we're talking about someone as small as Mikey was, this is somewhat more understandable. After all, we were long before the era of people like Rey Mysterio or Daniel Bryan going all the way to the world title scene back in 1995. So that's what made it all the more shocking when, after spending years being the guy who usually got beaten up before the night was over against opponents like Taz, Marty Jannetty, and Kevin Sullivan while he was working in the 2300 arena, something special began happening. And that special thing was fans getting behind the Buffalo native to a point that Paul Heyman thought it would be a good idea to put him in a world title match. Sure, he wouldn't win his first attempt at the gold, then being held by the Sandman, but then his second attempt came. And against all odds, this time Mikey Whipwreck would beat the champion to become ECW's new top dog. And this shook the ECW main event scene up, as for the next couple of months, Whipwreck found himself feuding with a pre-Stone Cold version of Steve Austin over the right to be called champ. And what made this feud all the better was that Austin wouldn't even be the one to win it in the end, as you'd assume. No, during their big singles match, Mikey would beat him. Sure, he would drop the belt back to the Sandman not long after that, and would from there return to more of a jobber role, but no matter how hard he might have fallen again in the years following, he was always able to rest easy knowing that, for a period of time there, he has been the world champion. And that's something very few wrestlers, jobber or otherwise, will ever actually be able to say about themselves. But let's move away from ECW for a moment and back over to WWF, as it's there we find our next subject, another notable jobber who came along a couple of years later during the heights of the Attitude Era. Who are we talking about here? Why, Gilbert, of course. Yes, it was at Survivor Series 1998 that a special mystery opponent was going to be announced for Mankind. At this time, though, as Mankind was a member of the corporation and so was going to get an easy route to the finals, his opponent was going to be the biggest jobber Vince McMahon could find. Who would the boss be able to find for such a role? Well, that would be none other than Dwayne Gil, or Gilbert as he would from then on be known. Yes, with Dwayne being a bald guy with a goatee, this one was a pretty blatant parody of Bill Goldberg over in WCW, with the idea here being that rather than being a world beater, Gilbert was the most inept wrestler on the planet, someone so bad that he'd even get scared of his own pyro whenever it went off as he was approaching the ring. Needless to say then, Dwayne Gil lost to Mankind that night, but this wouldn't be the end of his run in WWF. WWF. No, over the next year or two, he'd remain a constant presence in the company's undercard as one of the perennial jobbers they had under their employ. And this was never more evident than in his time as being part of the ultimate jobber stable, the Job Squad. That said, unlike other members of the Job Squad, for a brief window of time at least, Dwayne Gil would be able to overcome the limitations of being a glorified enhancement talent, as it was in November of 1998 that he became WWF Light Heavyweight Champion after beating Christian for the honor, with him subsequently going on to hold that belt for a total of 448 days. And in the era of stars like Steve Austin, The Rock, The Undertaker, Triple H, Kurt Angle, and many, many more, any chance to get on TV when the roster was so deep was great. But as time went on and the novelty of Gilbert wore off, he'd fade away from prominence, with him eventually leaving WWF altogether in 2000. Luckily then, there were plenty of other jobbers to take his place, one of which is our next subject, Colin Delaney. Yes, it was in 2007 that Colin Delaney became the next addition to the WWE CW roster, and realizing that this was a great opportunity for his career, the Rochester native immediately set about getting to work on trying to rise up the ranks after debuting there on December 18th of that year. Pretty quickly, though, he'd find any attempts he had at becoming a star were proving to be futile, as his role would almost immediately become to do jobs to bigger names like Mark Henry, Kane, and the Great Khali. And that led to WWE, in kayfabe at least, getting cold feet about giving him a full-time contract, with the story now switching to the idea that if he wanted to earn this contract, he'd have to at least pick up a win first. Yes, it was the Heath Slater special, and just as it would later work for him, it worked for Colin Delaney too, because on the smaller stage that was WWE CW, he was able to build up something of a cult status around himself as fans there got behind his attempts to finally score a victory. Sure, it wouldn't be easy for him, but eventually, when the time came for him to step into the ring with Armando Estrada on the May 6, 2008 episode of ECW, the New Yorker would get that elusive win and, as a result, be awarded an official contract with WWE. Where would he go from here? Well, not very far. He was still a jobber after all. That's right, after having his big moment in the sun, Delaney began to settle back into the role of being a guy who looked at the lights by the time the night was over. And that would all eventually lead to a situation where, in August of 2008, he'd be released from his contract, with him from there returning to the indie circuit where he's, for the most part, remained to this day. Still, at least he got his moment. And if nothing else, that puts him among the ranks of great jobbers in wrestling, right up there with our next subject, in fact, a true legend who went by the name of Iron Mike Sharpe. That's right, like everyone else we've looked at today, where this Ontario native excelled was in serving as an enhancement talent who could put over other bigger stars. Obviously then this served him well in WWF, as across two runs, first between 1983 and 1990, and then again between 1992 and 1995, he was a constant presence on Vince McMahon's television. Sure, he was never getting a push himself or anything, but he was getting a chance to work against some true talents. We're talking about names like Bob Backlund and Ivan Putski, just to name a few. Hell, at one point in 1984, he'd even get to team up with Hulk Hogan for a while, though this team-up would happen while the pair were touring over in Japan. Yes, it wasn't exactly the career breakthrough moment it could have been for the Canadian under other circumstances, but nevertheless, it was still teaming up with the biggest star of the era. And how many jobbers can say they've been able to do something like that? Almost none, that's how many. And that's why it was such a big deal for him at the time then. Alas, though, this would be the only real true height Mike Sharpe reached during his career, as the rest of it would see him firmly be in that undercard role, his job almost always to put someone else over. And that would continue even after he left the WWF in 1995 and spent the last few years of his career working on the indie circuit, taking on the likes of Virgil, King Kong Bundy, and Bam Bam Bigelow. Once this was over, however, things would change somewhat for Sharpe, as following his retirement, he'd opened his own wrestling school. That's right, for a significant period of time following his retirement, Mike Sharpe's school of pro wrestling would allow the Canadian to pass on everything he'd learned to the next generation. And this led to him training such people as Crowbar and the Harris Brothers. No, none of these performers would go on to main event to WrestleMania or anything, but then maybe that's fitting in a way, as the person who was showing them the ropes was one of the premier jobbers of the 80s and 90s wrestling. Was he as good of a jobber as our next subject, though? Well, that's a question which is certainly up for debate, as our next subject, a man who peaked around the same time as Iron Mike Sharpe, is none other than SD Jones. and unlike the Brooklyn Brawler or Barry Horowitz, Jones never had that big defining moment in the public eye. But then part of the reason for this is because much of his time spent as a wrestler was before the first big boom period. Yes, while he was still around during the 80s, it was in the 70s that the Antigua native first got his start in the industry. And these early years saw him work in places like Jim Crockett Promotions and the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Over time, however, it would mainly be the WWF he'd work for, and it was while there that he was truly established as a jobber. Why was this? Well, prior to that, Jones had found some modicum of success on the territory circuit as an NWA America's Tag Team Champion. Once he ventured over to WWF on a more full-time basis, however, he never again reached these heights. Rather, his role would be to work with names like Nikolai Volkov and Greg the Hammer Valentine, and in the process, lose to them. Sure, there were brief moments of SD Jones getting something semi-noteworthy to do here, such as the time he formed a brief tag team with Tony Atlas, or the time he at one point even partnered with Andre the Giant for a one-off appearance, but that was never enough for him to truly rise above the level of enhancement talent. One thing it was enough for, though, was to see him get not only one, but two action figures. Yes, back during the era of LJN figures, Special Delivery Jones would get multiple made in his image, with this making him one of the very rare jobbers who have ever received such an honor. That's right, while his name is not as well remembered as some of the other enhancement talents, SD Jones's resume quietly makes him one of the greatest jobbers to ever do it. Hell, in 2017 his efforts would even be recognized to the point that he'd be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, albeit as part of their Legacy Acts wing. But what about our next subject? That being James Ellsworth. Yes, it was on the July 25th, 2016 episode of Raw that Ellsworth would make his debut by challenging Braun Strowman. Sure, he might have believed he had a fighting chance against the monster among men, as any man with two hands would, but he just looked like such an underdog standing there in the middle of the ring waiting to be destroyed. It was impossible not to be endeared by his character. And that was exactly why, as the months went on then, WWE would continue to bring Ellsworth back for cameo appearances at things like the Royal Rumble, with this all leading to him eventually being plugged into the WWE title feud between Dean Ambrose and AJ Styles over on SmackDown in the autumn of that year. And when we say James was plugged in here, we don't just mean he was there to do more jobs. No, in a strange turn of events, he'd at one point actually score a victory over the WWE champion, Styles. Yes, for a little while at least, James Ellsworth was the lineal WWE champion, and if that's not an achievement he can hang his hat on as a jobber, we don't know what is. Obviously, though, his time in the main event scene was not destined to last. No, the novelty was always going to wear off for this, and that was why, once the whole thing ran its course, the Baltimore native would be moved back to something more fitting when he became the valet to Carmella during the period she was attempting to become SmackDown Women's Champion. How would this work out for Ellsworth? Quite well, as it happened, as he would remain in the WWE for a while longer, and it would technically lead to him becoming the first ever Miss Money in the Bank in 2017. On top of that, it would also lead to him getting to have some bouts against Asuka and Becky Lynch. In 2018, though, Ellsworth's time with WWE would come to an end when he was released from the company. So because of that then, when you remember the Chinless Wonder's time on WWE TV, you're going to remember the brief period where he was the biggest cult sensation the WWE had on their roster, someone who should never have been a star, but somehow managed to become one for a while, all while also maintaining his jobber status at the same time. But for as great of a jobber as he was at this point, there was arguably another who was even better, and that person would be our next subject as it happens. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Curt Hawkins. Come on now, how could we not talk about Curt Hawkins when we talk about great wrestling jobbers? After all, this is the man who quite literally was trained by a great jobber in Mikey Whipwreck, so it was almost like he took all the former ECW World Champion's power and added it to his own in order to create some kind of super enhancement talent. How would this go for his career? Exactly as you'd expect, because while the Glen Cove native was never a focused upon act, his time in the WWE as a lower card guy is legendary. Why was this? Well, because whether it be his time as a member of La Familia during the mid-2000s or his later team-ups with people like Vance Archer and Tyler Rex, he was a consistent presence in WWE for years as a guy who could always be brought in to make his opponent look great. and that not only gave him a quiet value with management, but also made him a bit of a cult sensation with fans after a while. So popular would it make him with WWE fans, in fact, when he left the company in 2014 and instead moved over to TNA, where he was treated like a bigger star, there was something of a push to see him return to WWE at some point down the line. And in the end, that's exactly what happened, as it was in 2016 that Hawkins made his re-debut in WWE. Not that he'd suddenly be a star now or anything, no, he was still very much a jobber, and this would soon see him going on an anti-Goldberg streak as he began losing match after match after match. Of course, every streak has to end eventually though, and this was where Curt Hawkins finally got his moment in the sun, because it was while he and his tag team partner Zack Ryder were challenging the Revival at, fittingly, the WrestleMania 35 pre-show, that he'd not only score a pinfall at last, but in the process he'd become a Raw Tag Team Champion. As you can probably guess, however, this was only a short run with the gold, and it wouldn't be long before Curt was back to his losing ways again. That said, it was still a great WrestleMania moment for the New Yorker, and since his most recent run with WWE ended, he's been able to segue this into singles gold success in TNA, the very place he's become a former Impact Digital Media champion. So it just goes to show that being a jobber does have its perks, and it can mean good things for someone's career. We guess it's like all things, it's just about how well you make the most out of what you're given.